Our next workshop is going to be about climate justice and youth action, and it's going to be hosted by Mashal Awais. And so Mashal is an environmental scientist with a background in chemistry and environmental analysis. Her work primarily focuses on environmental and climate change related issues, ranging from risk communication and disaster recovery, all the way to mitigating health impacts of environmental pollution for fenceline and underinvested communities. So she's also the co-chair of the Houston Climate Movement and the chair of the Youth Climate Justice Council, where she advocates for youth as decision makers in local climate action. That's a lot, and it's a lot of impactful work, and we look forward to hearing more from her. So I'll hand the floor over to her so she can go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Give me a thumbs up. Cool. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. I also am here with a friend of mine named Madeline, who I invited. She's joining us all the way from Brown University, where she's currently an undergrad, and we've been working together this past couple of years, really working to push for youth in climate action locally. So she can also jump in. She'll be jumping in and talking a little bit more about all the work that we've been doing together. And I just want to thank you all for inviting us to be here today. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about some of the projects that you're going to be coming up with through the Ideathon. So give me 1 second to share my screen, and I'll dive right into our workshop. Okay, so this is just kind of like the logos of who we are. I like mentioned before, I've mostly been doing a lot of my work through with regards to climate action with Houston Climate Movement, and been partnering with local organizations such as Sunrise Houston, Houston Youth Climate Strike, Rise Climate Alliance, and those are some of our local partners. So just a quick introduction of myself and the work that we're doing and our agenda. So I'm basically going to be talking a little bit about what I define or what we define as climate justice here locally. And then we'll talk about, Madeline's going to jump into like what youth action has been going on in terms of climate change in Houston and all the incredible work that youth have been doing here locally. And then we're going to talk about maybe a couple of minutes about the intersections of climate change and COVID-19. And if anyone has any questions, we're really happy to discuss and engage with y'all. So that's going to be like the last 5 or 10 minutes of the conversation. So who we are. So like I said, Houston Climate Movement is basically a group of advocates that work in promoting climate action. It was formed around 2017, and they've been pushing for Houston to adopt climate action plans. So they've been working really closely. A lot of the members of Houston Climate Movement have been working really closely with the city of Houston to create a climate action plan. And also at the county level, we've been having conversations more recently to engage with county officials to create a climate action plan for the region. And within that, you know, we've in 2019 decided, well, we also really want to have a space for youth to be able to engage with our decision makers and be a part of that process. So we created a Youth Climate Justice Council within the Houston Climate Movement. And that's kind of where all the conversations with our organizations such as Houston Youth Climate Strike, Rise Climate Alliance, Sunrise, and all the youth that are working together in these different spaces. So I kind of just want to ask ourselves as we go deeper into this is how do we define climate change and the impact of climate change? And with that, I wanted to share this picture of Houston. So a lot of the work that I do as an environmental scientist is looking at communities that are on the front line, that are facing the brunt of petrochemical refineries and live really in close proximity. So we call them fenceline communities. I'm not sure if people in this audience are already, some of y'all, I mean, we all come from Houston, so some of y'all also might be really familiar with that or live in close proximity to industrial sites. I know I live close to some factories and things like that, thanks to Houston having no zoning. So with that comes all sorts of air quality issues. So when we look at climate change and who it's impacting, so I guess a couple of things come to mind. So one of the things that originally, when I guess the conversation starts with climate change and the impact of climate change, we often imagine melting polar ice caps and like the polar bears and all these endangered animals. But more and more so, when we're looking at local communities in Houston, how do we define what our environment is? And in the environmental justice movement and in the climate justice movement, that conversation also expands into our environment being where we live, where we play, where we learn, where we interact, and where we build our own communities. So when we're looking at environments and urban environments in particular, those conversations kind of take a different narrative, because when we're looking at climate change impact here in Houston, it's oftentimes a different lens, right? We're not looking at polar bears anymore. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we're looking at communities that get most impacted by air quality issues, emission related issues, flooding issues, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into that as well. So what is climate justice? So within the climate justice movement, there's a lot of conversation also that talks about environmental justice. And when we talk about environmental justice, these are just questions that I threw in this presentation for us to kind of think about. And as you all build your ideas, who are the communities that are facing the impact of pollution? So environmental justice sort of puts that perspective of the socioeconomics into the framework when we're looking at communities of color. For example, in Houston, in particular, communities of color are the ones that are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. So with rising sea levels and increase of flooding, we will see oftentimes more and more so communities that are at the front line are the communities of color that already are facing the burden of a lot of environmental degradation in their neighborhoods and in their communities. So these are just, when you start diving a little bit deeper into it, you'll realize, or we realize, that these issues are all interrelated. So when thinking of solutions, we have to kind of encompass all of the socioeconomics as well as climate change strategy. So I kind of wanted you all to take this, I think I'll have to stop sharing my screen a little bit, and I wanted you all to answer this question. So what do you think of when you hear the terms youth and climate justice? So we're gonna do a quick little 2 minutes of making a word bubble. So I'm gonna share this link real quick. 1 second. Sorry, I'm not the most adept with slide shares, even though I'm doing it a few times a day. But I'm just going to drop this link in the chat, and I hope that you all can spend some time answering and just putting some words in this word bubble, and we can look at it together. So I put that in the chat. Let me know if you can see it and access it, so we can kind of I put some answers in there for myself whenever I think of climate justice. I'm trying to think of how do we end injustice in our communities, how do we engage more people as decision makers, and how do we empower communities that are often not at the table. So I'm seeing engagement, kids, environment, equality. What are some other things that you all can think of? Renew. advancement, innovation, trash bash. That's a cool word. Frontlines, teamwork, a livable future. I resonate with that. Frontline, ending injustice. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And as this word bubble keeps populating, I'm going to go back to my slides. And so yeah, this is another, can you all see my slides again? Okay, so this is something that I took from Union of Concerned Scientists. So when we're looking at Houston and Hurricane Harvey, and people are studying trends of like, well, with rising sea levels and floods, storm surge, these are some of the Superfund sites that Houston has. So, you know, as the years go on, you can see how a lot of our Superfund sites are going to be faced with a double crisis of rising sea waters as well. So being able to come up with solutions that are really innovative to be able to address all these topics is kind of like our biggest challenge of the time. So air pollution and environmental justice. You know, we're living in Houston, and Houston is an environmental justice city. So a lot of the things that we look at, for example, I'm not sure how many people in this room, definitely feel free to raise your hand and jump in and share your experience or talk about it towards the end of it. But a lot of us that live in Houston, I'm sure some of you remember the ITC fire that happened in 2019 and the communities that were impacted in Deer Park and Pasadena. So a lot of communities and residents that live in Houston face like the significant impact of living directly on the front lines. So, you know, there are studies that talk about how many children have asthma. So what does that have to do with when you look at communities of color or people that live in close proximity to refineries and all this other stuff? How do they get impacted? So there's a quality of education lag right there as well. So these are just ways that we can think about when we're thinking of climate change and coming up with climate action solutions for our city. How can we make it just and equitable? How can we make sure that young people aren't getting aren't missing school because they're suffering from asthma because our air quality is really bad? So some of the things that I look at, I'm just going to skim through this real fast, you know, is studying human health and understanding risk assessments, and how do we communicate that to community members. So these are some of the things that we look at. And this is a community in Manchester, Harrisburg, really close to the ship channel. So you'll see the Port of Houston right here. You see Valera's refinery, and then you see a community over here. So these are communities that are what we call on the fence line. So there's all sorts of issues that residents face in these communities. But the biggest one is air quality and water quality, and that will significantly impact their quality of life. So when we're looking at environmental education programs as well, you'll see these things come up. So I've pulled these screenshots from this resource called EcoRise. They put together a map that you can overlay. Well, I'll go back to that in a second. You can overlay flood data and air quality index and things like that to be able to see what are the communities that are most impacted and how can we come up with programs that are serving all communities. This just shows you a map of Houston's ship channel and like all the refineries and the air monitors. So one thing that I really advocate for is air quality in Houston, and how do we improve and get better air quality, like a better picture of Houston. Because if you look at it, we have so many refineries all around these communities, but not that many TCEQ air monitoring sites, which then will impact how policy gets written, because there's there's not a clear picture. So there's a lot of people doing incredible work to address that. And one of the things that I advocate for is when you understand all these intersections of communities that are at the front line, there's a conversation about climate equity, and that's something that we're building within the City of Houston's Climate Action Plan framework as well. And I'm happy that Tomas was able to present right before me. So we're in good conversation with the city to be able to come up with solutions for that. But yeah, a lot of these questions you all can think about as well. How do you partner with community educators? How do you partner with community organizers? And here again, you can see Fifth Ward was at the highest. Fifth Ward was really significantly impacted by flooding. And, you know, this is just again from the Gen Thrive data. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining these maps just so that we can have Madeline share her perspective as well. So, yeah, this is a project that I did, which was really awesome, doing community-based participatory research. So I really believe that communities that are being impacted with issues that are climate change related, such as rising, you know, being exposed to floodwaters, and Hurricane Harvey being such a huge example for us to be able to work with communities to be able to understand what their risk was and how do they identify solutions for themselves and their communities, what happened and what wasn't there. So there's a lot of interest in people being able to understand, okay, if we think Hurricane Harvey happened 3 years ago, there's homes that still aren't rebuilt and that haven't recovered from Hurricane Harvey. So that's an injustice issue as well in Houston. And oftentimes you will see it's the same communities that face the impact again. So, you know, this is a little bit more about that, and how can we build trust in communities, and how do we build disaster systems and hurricane preparedness systems locally that can have communities play a role in being that voice. And I think that that's something that's really important for you all as well. And this Ideathon to be here is like you being part of communities and being youth, you know, identifying solutions for your own communities and for your own neighborhoods that are that's going to be the most impactful for yourselves. And I think I mentioned this a little bit, is like working with the city. We've been working with the city of Houston, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as far as like the youth and equity working groups within the climate action plan's implementation. So having that multidisciplinary solution-based approach, I definitely am interested to see what y'all's ideas are in terms of climate change strategies. And how do you incorporate that citizen science? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Madeline, and Madeline can share all the efforts that youth have been undertaking and how we've been working together in that regard. And Madeline, just tell me to move to the next slide if you need me to.
Yes, thank you so much, Mashal. I hope that you have all enjoyed listening to her talk endlessly about climate justice and injustice, especially within our city. It's been a pleasure for me to get to learn from her throughout these years and to work under her. Excuse me. Growing up in such a city, this reality is something that we all intimately know, even if we don't know that we know it intimately, because of how much it is kind of ingrained within what it means to be a young person in this city, to grow up in a community that is facing the front lines, facing the brunt of this crisis, and to understand the layers of oppression and the layers of history that have created it. So, and when we understand all that, when we get really educated, when we learn from fantastic people like Mashal, we feel the need to take action. And I have definitely definitely empathize with that sentiment that we want to take action. And in Houston, we have a really fantastic array of opportunities to do so. And they have been happening in the youth climate movement since about the winter, spring of 2019. So nearly 2 years at this point. There's been a really robust movement. And let's go to the next slide, please. So often when you think of like a movement, especially a youth climate movement, you'll think of like protests like this. And this is a demonstration that happened in the early fall in September of 2020, led by an organization called Houston Youth Climate Strike. We founded the organization to create the climate strikes, if you guys know about the international movement. And this was a protest to kind of commemorate the year anniversary of the international strikes. And we were talking about how the intersections of COVID-19 are really, really, and all the death associated with it are really prevalent in our community, and how the trauma of experiencing such a terrible pandemic is really compounded with the trauma of living on the front lines of the crisis. So all of our issues are really intersectional, and they bring us to protest. As young people, we understand it uniquely. Yeah, sure, we can go to the next slide. So one of the also cool things is that to be involved and to take action, it looks like so many different things, and you can do it in whatever way fits your kind of theory of change, your method of taking action, and whatever you're most comfortable with. So yes, you can protest, you can join an organization and organize people and get out there with your signs and your umbrellas and your art and your passionate voices and your speeches. Or you can do as many of these as you like. But we also have places to connect that are more aligned with the city of Houston, like you guys were all listening to Tamal when he was giving that presentation. So as you all know from that workshop, we as a city have a climate action plan, but to implement it is a really difficult thing because it's so vast and it means different things to different people. And as young people, we have a stake in this crisis and in this plan like no others, because we're the ones who are inheriting this city. So to join our working group, you can choose to become an ambassador of a specific community, which is really great. You might represent a school, you might represent a neighborhood, you might represent an identity or a cultural or a religious or any sort of type of identity-based group that you hold and are you a part of that you could represent. Like, I want to enact and advance and lead climate action for that community, and that is really wonderful. And you can do that by designing projects, youth-led community-based projects through this working group, and you have no experience whatsoever. I know that sounds really big, lead a whole project for a community, but if you join the working group and you become an ambassador, we have months and months of training and preparation and onboarding orientation stuff. And it's not very, it's a couple hours a week, but over the couple of months, we get you really acclimated and we teach you everything you need to know and let you teach us, because there's so much about your communities that people across the city don't know and don't understand, and you're the ones who know it best. So that's why you'll collaborate with other ambassadors to create programs and projects that are most effective and most powerful to you as the community member, as the young person. And this is so important because if you go, backside, we need to address the gap between the city and youth. Oftentimes our voices are not heard. Oftentimes we see the city and it feels frustrating, difficult, even disappointing when they are allying with these giant corporations that cause this crisis, but they aren't allying with the youth. So that's why we as the Sunrise Movement in Houston, we as Houston Youth Climate Strike, we as Houston Climate Movement's Youth Justice, Climate Justice and Youth Council, these are like the three big organizations, we banded together to say we want to leverage the power of youth voices. We want to leverage our moral authority as the next generation and as a frontlines group and as people from so many diverse backgrounds and communities within this city to hold the city accountable, the city being the government, accountable for creating climate action that looks and feels like what our community needs. There are major shortcomings and lack of transparency for community members in the climate action plan's drafting process, and we're trying to rectify this. We're trying to bring people in and uplift the youth. So what has youth climate engagement looked like in Houston so far? I talked a lot about this working group, but we have so many different types of engagement that, as I was saying earlier, you really cannot go wrong. Sure, you can be part of the City of Houston's working group outreach, or you could join our organization. The Sunrise Movement is a national organization fighting for Green New Deal, livable jobs, and a just transition, and we have a hub here. We have really a high school and middle school focused organization. If you are in college, there is some room for you mostly, but it's high school and middle school, called Houston Youth Climate Strike, which plans strikes and other types of protests to engage with the community. And so Sunrise Movement is community organizing and political engagement because it helps to get elected officials into office. And often Houston Youth Climate Strike is community organizing within high schools, and then it's political engagement because while it doesn't do as much voter contact as, say, like the Sunrise Movement, it meets often with politicians, especially right now in the Texas state legislature, to get our politicians to prioritize the legislation that we need for justice, for community-based justice. And the Houston Climate Movement's Climate Justice and Youth Council focuses intersectionality and implementing the climate action plan within our communities through a really community-based, youth-based lens, and like bringing everyone together. So there's so many different things you can do, and it's just entirely up to you as much as you could envision it. We're always looking for new members in all of our organizations. And of course, like at this moment, the youth working group is really the big thing.
Thanks so much, Madeline, for sharing all of that. And I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about climate justice and COVID-19. We've talked a lot about like the intersections of climate justice and health. So with the health inequity, we're also looking at the pandemic, and I know that that's a topic area that you all are going to be discussing as well. So I just wanted to share this map that I saw. I'm forgetting, I tagged them in my slides, but I'll share the link again. It's in the resources. I can share the slide deck with all you all to see later. But it's prepared by Community Data Resource Center, I think, with the University of Houston. So yeah, this kind of just lays out the picture of like where your vaccine providers are, where your vaccine hubs are, and how, you know, the COVID crisis, and I'm sure that there's other people that are going to be talking more about this in detail, but the COVID crisis in itself is also looking at, when we're looking at communities of color, we know that communities of color are the highest impacted by this pandemic, and the fact that you'll see your vaccine hubs are on the west side of Houston versus most of communities of color are residing in 3rd Ward, 5th Ward, and on the east side of Houston, and further in Southwest. So that's another thing to think about when we're thinking of coming up with solutions that are just and equitable, especially in terms of also like this health crisis that we're looking at, is how do we come up with solutions for addressing the COVID crisis as well. So really, you know, just to summarize really quickly, like Tomas has mentioned before, with the Climate Action Plan, there's a ton of opportunity to implement the Climate Action Plan in your own communities. So you can sign up to be a part of the youth working group. And then there's all these youth-based activist organizations that Madeline's talked about, Houston Youth Climate Strike, Sunrise, and our Climate Justice Youth Council that you can sign up and be a part of. And we're working closely with the city to be able to come up with youth-based climate action. And then, you know, how can you locally get involved with local organizations to build a just future? And I really look forward to seeing all of y'all's ideas coming out of the Ideathon. I wanted to thank y'all for your time and for listening to our presentation. At this point, I'd like to open it up to questions. So our emails are listed here, and I want to thank PEAC and UNICEF and the City of Houston for organizing this event and for inviting us to be here. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, because I think we went a little bit over.
We can ask if anybody has like 1 or 2 questions, we can take those. I think we have one in the chat. Karen asked, holding city governments available or accountable, sorry. How do we do that? How do we hold the governance in schools accountable too? Sorry if I messed up that question there.
How do we hold governance in schools accountability to?
I can jump in and say I was trying to answer it in the chat. I wrote up a little bit of an answer. I would say everyone has their own philosophy. So sometimes it looks like protest, sometimes it's from the outside. It's protesting, it's calling into meetings, it's going to city council meetings and giving speeches. It is, really targeting, going to city hall, going to other offices, nonviolent protest, meetings, advocacy, all of that. And sometimes it's from the inside. It's creating these working groups. It's not even just joining working groups. The city wanted young people to join working groups, but we said we don't think that we can hold the city accountable effectively enough without our own space. So we advocated for a youth working group, and that's what we got, and that's what we designed. And this working group is entirely organization created and run. The city did not think of the idea to create this group. It did not create this group. It didn't design this group, and it's not running this group. It's the organizations. And so that is really powerful, that there's a community-based, youth-based organizational group that is part of the city's plan to implement this plan. So we can steer, we can make sure our voices are heard, because otherwise they wouldn't have been included in conversations and actions to actually implement this hugely consequential plan. And so, some people aren't comfortable protesting, some people aren't comfortable working inside the city. It's up to you, and there's really no right answer. You make it what it is, and you can do the exact same thing with your school government. You can protest, you can have meetings, you can have petitions, you can join the youth working group and create a project that is targeting your school administration and trying to get them to, holding them accountable by trying to get them to take climate action. So there's so many ways I couldn't possibly name them all.
Just to add to that, thanks, Madeline. Just to add to that, I think that the city's been really responsive to the initial sort of demand to have a youth space. So to create the youth working group within the climate action plan's implementation has been a really fun and creative process from our end to be able to see that response, and we really hope to keep building that. And working also internally myself, I've been having conversations with the Department of Education, and so with that, I'd extend that out to anyone in this room if they're interested in having conversations with their school administration to kind of have an understanding and build climate action policies and strategies within their administration. I think there's several ways to go about it. Any other questions?
It doesn't look like we have any more questions. I want to thank Mashal and Madeline for coming out to speak to our students. The presentation was great. I hope that students learned a lot. Just another announcement to all the students in the group. The proposal is due at 2:45, so you have approximately an hour left to submit it. So please watch the time.